Hi all, my name is Amy Goldthwait. I'm standing in for Cynthia Sears today. She's out sick. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kristin Tollefson, who is our education director here at BIMA and also an amazing artist. She's won a lot of awards for her work, both in the art world and as an educator. She's also traveled extensively to Iceland, which the show we have up now features artists from Iceland. We are honored to have Kristin here. She's an island treasure, 2008, and 2008, right?
Yeah.
And a quiet genius present in our midst. Kristin Tollefson.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. I don't even know where to start with that. So I am here to talk a little bit about my long-term relationship with Iceland and my relationship to book arts. Amy, lovely introduction, thank you. My background is actually as a metalsmith, and I have a master's degree in metalsmithing from Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan, and I have related to book arts through this idea of narrative and storytelling and record keeping, and I talk about trying to make sense of the world, and a lot of times for me that has required breaking things down into really small, manageable components because things can tend to be overwhelming. So what I hope to show you is talk a little bit about my time in Iceland and then talk a little bit about how it's influenced my work today and kind of what's coming in the future. So I welcome, this is not meant to be a formal lecture. Please feel free to interrupt, ask questions, touch things. So I'm going to start by giving you a little background on, actually I think I put this in the wrong. A little background on my trip to Iceland, which was right after graduate school in 1992. And this was a map that I purchased in the United States of Iceland. Let's make sure I get it correctly oriented. This was kind of a prized possession. I'm sure that who here has never seen a map of Iceland? Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about the country, when I arrived, it was 1992, and it was only about 4 years after Prohibition had stopped in Iceland. So things were still a little bit post-World War II in that country. The airport had just transitioned from a NATO base to an actual airport, and the NATO base was still active, and I had friends who lived on the base and were teachers. And that was located, or it is located down, and I'm sorry for this kind of wonky thing. The airport's actually in Keflavik, which is about 35 kilometers away from, 35 miles away from Reykjavik, which is the main city. And what you can see on this map is this pink line that circumnavigates and kind of goes out into the fjords, but circumnavigates the country. This is called the Ring Road. And I knew enough about Iceland to know that the Ring Road was kind of this epic trip. It had just been completed, and then it had been partially washed out by floods and then rerouted. So back in the 90s, it was still kind of a wild place to go. And I went very naively with my mountain bike and my camping gear and thought that I would circumnavigate by myself on my mountain bike. I did, not completely on my own with the bike, but I took buses intermittently and one time chartered a plane, and it was a wild time. And I was young. I was 24 when I arrived. So the reason I was there was I was awarded a Fulbright grant and a fellowship from the American Scandinavian Foundation to do some research on how literary arts depicted place. And when I was a graduate student, I was really interested in how environment impacted art and how installing a piece of artwork in the elements could transform it, how you could record sound, all these things. So this seemed like a really good place for me to go. And I was kind of led there by books like this, which were published in the 50s, that were kind of romanticized ideas of Iceland and what it was like to live there. It was still really, I mean, if you remember 1950s National Geographics, like this, and you remember those pictures of quaint people in their living in their, you know, living in their natural settings. It was really kind of old way of looking at different cultures, but this was something that was still, there wasn't a lot of information about Iceland at that time. There was no direct flight from Icelandair from Seattle. And, you know, I even considered taking not a steamship, but getting a ride on a freighter, right, to get there, because it was still kind of, nobody knew why I was going. It was so far out there. But I was intrigued by, the landscape was very beautiful. I'm going to go ahead and pass these around. As an anthropology and art history major in college, this was really something that kind of excited me to think about this culture that was still fairly pure. Their language, they had held on to Icelandic really adamantly and created new words, like for computer. They had their own word for computer. And actually, I'm going to refer to a book that's in the table that maybe we can see later that has parts of the Icelandic telephone book, which is categorized by first name. So you would have your first name listed in the book. It would be the entire country listed in the phone book, and people would be able to find you because they would know your first name and where you lived, and then the patronymic declination of your name. I was also really interested in, this is W.H. Auden's Letters from Iceland, which again was a British accounting, and W.H. Auden is a very funny, dry writer who talks about going and, these kind of odd habits of Icelanders that he chronicled. So these were all the things that kind of brought me there in the first place. When I arrived, the scene was totally different. I mean, I thought here I was going to ride my bike around. The winds were gale force winds, and it was windy all the time. I actually got blown off the road into a drainage ditch one time. And but the people were amazing. The house I lived in was not in the city, and it was not even in a town. It was off the main grid, in an old farmhouse that had been a pig and chicken farm, and it was the farmhouse that I lived in upstairs. So I was really isolated. I spent a lot of time alone after that trip around the country, and had taken some Icelandic at the university. But what I ended up looking at was the landscape around me, and I'm going to just go through a little bit of this. If anybody has questions about the artist books that are here from Iceland too, I am not an authority, but I think you'll see what I was struck by was the similarities between some of the techniques and the content that I had done back in the early 90s and what Icelanders themselves are looking at. And so this is the one that I referred to that has the telephone book cut out in it. And you can see the little rectangle here on the map, and that shows where this map is and where the hike is. It's called Landmannalaugar to Thorsmork. And so I'm just going to show you briefly a lot of things that I did when I was there, really related to maps. You can just, as a guide here, this is a glacier. Or was a glacier. I'm not actually sure the situation with this one at this point, but you can see you can just see what the different terrain is. If you've read a topographical map, you can see that there are mountains and there's a lot of up and down through this area. So this is the map that we used on the hike. It was a 3-day hike with a friend who was the son of the caretaker of the place that I was staying. And I was prepared in that I had hiking boots and I had a backpack, but I was completely naive to the, hiking 3 days straight, and it was really tough. My boots didn't fit exactly right, and it was hard. I mean, people take 5 days to do it. We did it in 3. So when I came back, one of the first things I did was to make this book, which chronicled the hike. And so this is, and it's been really great for me to pull these things out again after so many years. You can see that I transcribed the map and I indicated where each one of these items had come from. And I just made a little notation about what each one was. There was a place where I found obsidian, which was amazing. There was this green stone, there were bones, and I will be honest, this is the skin from the bottom of my foot when I was with the blisters. So a big thing with maps and storytelling and the sagas in Iceland is place names. Place names have importance from people's relationships to place and also with regard to describing the place. So I think that I started understanding that quite early on and listed these place names as I went. The specimen bags are also something that you'll see coming up. Go ahead and pass that around. Nothing here is very precious, so please feel free to look and touch. I continued exploring in Iceland, and I brought a couple of really kind of rudimentary sketches that I did while I was in the studio. They're not book pieces, but they were examples of the colors that I was seeing and kind of the feeling of this really grassy but barren otherwise landscape. I also took a bunch of pictures, and this was from an installation of some of the pictures that I had along with the objects that I was discovering in these places. The area that I lived was just south of an aluminum smelting factory that's still very active there, but the area itself was a summer home area, and people had lots of little huts, and there had been fishing houses, fishing cabins. So there were abandoned homes, there were things that people had left that they probably didn't realize they had left. These stone walls made out of pumice. A lot of this corrugated metal siding. And let's see this last one. Oh, right close to the ocean, and there were some wrecked boats, fishing boats. On one visit to a place called Búðir, I picked up these stones, which are remarkable because they're so incredibly smooth. They just imagine a whole beach with these, and that the reason that they are smooth like this is because they're just continually pounded by the North Atlantic Ocean. So I'll go ahead and pass those around. Go ahead, just rub your fingers all over them. They're just, imagine I packed a bunch of these and put them in my suitcase. I am just going to pass this around. Again, it's not technically a book, but it serves the same purpose as a sketchbook would have for me. These are specimen bags with little samples of all manner of things that I found in the lava fields close to where I lived. So when I started settling in, I would take these long walks in the lava fields, and this is Dwarf Birch. I don't have anything labeled because at the time I just was more interested in kind of creating a cabinet of curiosities, just looking at the images. One of my favorite things is this key. Well, you'll find it in there. There are pieces of bone. There's a little mushroom. So these things stayed in the studio with me. Here's the key, which I thought was really beautiful. So this feeling of discovering, here's part of a broken plate. Discovering this, there were ghosts around. I mean, there are remnants of people and kind of their interaction with the landscape.
Is there any way you can tell how old that key is?
That's a good question. That, yeah, huh? It's a Viking key? Yeah, it's really old. No, but actually the key came from the backyard of Gudrun and Ivar, the dear friends of mine who lived in Reykjavik, so it was a key from the city, a key to the city. Another map. This is a map of just the little southern part of Iceland, where you can see here Keflavik, where the airport is. You can see the road that goes to Reykjavik, and the house where I was right here at Strömsvik, which means stream harbor. And I didn't really understand what that meant until an extreme high tide with the full moon, and there was some sort of a stream that ran underground that served the house with water. And at the very high tide, it started running salt water. And I didn't realize that until I had made some really salty soup. And so this is significant also. You can see when I talk about the lava fields, this whole area where it's kind of lightly hatched from this red road over, just this whole area is all lava field. And it never really grew trees, so a lot of the landscape was very mossy or this low scrub growth. But I spent a lot of time walking out there, and one of the things that I did was a daily walk from the studio out to the ocean. And suppose this is a bona fide artist book that starts with some views of the area around the house up here, taken at different times of the year. And you'll see as you flip through these images that they kind of bounce back and forth between snowy landscape or landscape without. Oh yeah, that's a picture of the house where I lived. So I didn't know that was stuck in there. So each day I would take a little set of cards and draw sketches while I was walking, and then come back to the studio and finish them. And I think you can see that I have a really tight hand with the drawing. I don't know that I'm really proud of that. All of my little stones look like bowling balls, but this was a great way to just take note of the road that went from my house out to the ocean. And this was a part of a bigger piece called Rauðleið frá Strömi, which means red road from Strömur. And you'll see, I think you can see here, that the road was paved with red lava gravel. And so it actually was a red road. But you can flip through this just like this. It can actually be installed. It's probably about 15 feet long, so it can be stretched all the way out. But it came with its own map. You'll be surprised to hear that it was installed on the wall, spread out, and there was I created a little almost like an interpretive panel that had the map, and everything was numbered and corresponded. The really delightful part of this was that when it was shown in a little gallery in the next town over, people from town came to see the show, and they recognized, oh, that was Thor's house, or that was Sverre's house, or, so there was storytelling that came out of that. Again, not so much a book, but this is a whole collection. I might just put these out on the table so we can look at them and you can pass individual ones around. This was a collection of fictional landscapes that I created out of tourist literature from Iceland. And part of the big mystery for people was that they had heard of Iceland as the land of fire and ice. They had heard of Iceland as, this place where Björk lived, and Björk believed she believed that elves lived in the lava fields, and I can attest to the fact that they do. But they really had no idea what Iceland was, and it was an interesting time where Iceland was just starting to be a little more self-reflexive, and the tourist literature was starting to look a little more sexy, and pictures were being shown, but there were some really odd combinations of exposures and colors, and I was interested in how these things what people imagined and what was real. So I did, again, this was a whole cluster of images, and I'm just gonna pass these around. Do that this way. I did do a piece, and I'm not sure where it is right now, but it was made of all the letters that people had sent me when I was in Iceland, because that was still a time when people sent letters. As I can show you, my mom, who's here today, saved all the letters that I wrote to my folks, and those are some of them. It was still really common for me to write letters. I was always an excitable letter writer, and thought that it was a good opportunity to do funny things like put stamps that didn't really apply, or use my best penmanship. I think there's a postcard of the view outside my studio window. So people wrote me letters as well, and they would tell me what Iceland was like. And some of the descriptions were so theatrical that I kind of excised them from the letters and created a whole compilation of people's descriptions of the landscape. I have a bigger piece or two pieces that are going to be a little bit awkward to show, so I'm not sure, I might clear this off and try to roll them out here. I think after I got over the initial excitement of being, just being in this new country and looking and trying to kind of literally chronicle things, I started remembering what my background was as a metalsmith and as a jeweler who had made their portfolio in their kitchen using electrical wire, and just thinking about the place in a kind of a different way. And I was invited to have a solo show in this little, really tiny gallery, but I took it very seriously. And I made a series of these 3 maps. The maps were of 3 different places through my travels in Iceland, from which I collected different self-similar objects. So one was from a beach where I had collected a bunch of unusual looking sea glass That one I don't have. One was from a beach where I collected a bunch of rocks that had been colored with iron oxide. It was a really iron-rich, there was a lot of iron-rich surface water that turned things kind of orangey red. And one from basically a car dump in the middle of the lava field where people just go and drive their old cars into the, like in the old days when they would throw things into the ditch or throw things into the water. There's stuff like that on Bainbridge, or there used to be more, where people would just drive their car out into the woods and leave it, drive it off a cliff. And so this last one was automobile glass from this car dump. And the maps, I may just show you what this looks like. They're kind of dusty. So, oh, that would be great. So this is one of the maps. This is, I tried to do it to scale, so I gridded out the paper. And I was interested in the map being subservient to the piece that was displayed on top of it. So that's why it's graphite on black. And maybe we can just lay it out on the table and I can demonstrate how it would have been installed. And again, I hope this is not terribly disappointing for those of you who came to hear about artist books, but
No, that's inspiring. Yeah, it really is.
So this is the piece that I created from the stones that were kind of colored by the iron oxide. And the way this would have been displayed on the map is in some indication down here. And I'm sorry, I'll show this up again for the video. For those of you who can't see all the way in the back, it's just basic steel wire that's been hand twisted and bent into links and little beads that hold everything together. So this would have been displayed on the map with reference to where the stones had been discovered. And so something kind of like that. I also brought the necklace made out of broken automobile glass. And it's unusual glass. I mean, it's not the safety glass that we have today. It's not modern safety glass. Who knows if it was even safety glass? But there are these amazing shapes, and
Is it sharp?
it's not sharp.
Were they
No.
all the same shape?
They were kind of uniform, yeah, crystal like. So.
How were they attached?
They are, you'll see when I pass this around, there's fine wire wrapped around the end and made into a little pendant, and then they're linked together in kind of an S-shaped linking chain. So again, this is like the simplest kind of necklace, almost like a rosary. It's not soldered, it's not done with fine metal at all, but I was interested in the way that you could make something very mundane or throwaway into something that could be beautiful. And I think I've tried wearing this before. There you go. So some of the things that I was looking at obviously had to do with landscape, but I was also privileged to go to the museum, the National Museum in Reykjavik, where they have an amazing collection of women's traditional textiles. And this is just a little tourist book that has pictures, not really any words about the traditional costume. And you saw in that National Geographic really a great image of the thing that excited me the most about this. This woman is wearing a garment that has this border that is a botanical, like an abstracted, stylized botanical chain, kind of. And what I learned about this over the years, because I've been back to Iceland a number of times, is that this pattern was something that was created, it was commissioned basically in the 1800s when Iceland started becoming more aware of its independence, when it became independent from Denmark, and the government decided that they wanted to have only Icelandic things represented and only, no more Danish stuff, just Icelandic stuff. So an artist was commissioned to design these different motifs that would be used on the women's garments, and they were all native Icelandic plants that had been very stylized into these patterns. And the part of the reason this was exciting to me was that I had been thinking about botanical forms for my work, and those of you who have seen my sculptural work know that this kind of abstracted or stylized botanical form is something that resonates with me. The technique is called baldering, which is an embroidery technique with metal thread that in typical Icelandic fashion was done just on the surface of the garment, so you didn't actually stitch through to the back because that would be wasteful. You wouldn't see that shiny stuff. So it's basically couched or stitched onto the surface of the garment. And the image, when you see the close-up of it, it looks a lot like this wire work that I was doing in my sculptural work. So this led to a whole other rabbit hole that I pursued with regard to traditional Icelandic embroidery. And what I discovered was this fabulous thing. And again, not an artist book, but all these little things that I've ferreted away inside that are popping out. This is, it says, leiðarvísir til að nema ýmsar kvenlegar handyrðir, which basically says it's a guidebook to women's handicrafts, women's needlework. And this was self-published in this form from an original manuscript that was published in 1886. And this just shows a bunch of different patterns that were used in different kinds of techniques. So that baldering technique had specific patterns that went with it, and embroidery had specific patterns that went with it. But they were all these, here's some needlepoint patterns. So this is an interesting collection that was inspiring to me about how people kept track of things, and especially that there was this kind of approach to botanical forms that seemed to connect with what I was doing.
Was that sold as a guidebook?
This was actually this was printed for me by the women who had reproduced it, made a limited run, and so they made this one. But years later, that advanced to this, which is ornaments and patterns found in Iceland. And this takes a lot of the same images, but a group of computer-minded folks imported the images into computer graphics, so pixels, and translated all these different patterns into pixelated images. And it even comes with a CD in the back, which shows that it's already out of date. But you can see, so this would be kind of like guidebooks that were used in the 1800s during Art Nouveau, that were resources for artists or designers to use different kinds of botanical forms in their artwork. And so The tradition of books in Iceland is also really important. It's, I think there's almost 100% literacy rate in that country, and many publishing houses, many people who consider themselves either professional or avocational authors or poets. The guy who did the extermination on the house where I was living was also a poet and read his poetry on national radio, and so the whole tradition of literature and books in Iceland was really significant. It's heavy.
Find that book in Iceland?
This one is from Iceland.
Is
Yeah.
it?
Hmm.
While you were there?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that brings me back to these two books. This one is Flora Íslands, and this one is Flowering Plants and Ferns of Iceland. And part of what I found interesting was that whole nationalist approach to, we're only going to show Icelandic stuff, we're only going to use Icelandic things, because that's something that we talk about, native plants. The conversation about that is an interesting metaphor for what goes on in politics also. And so this book was published, it's a Danish book, published in Icelandic, and this one, I think it was republished in 1924. It's a traditional guidebook with, some kind of sweet botanical illustrations and some little descriptions of what the plants were, and then the Latin. No, it doesn't. Let's see. It does have the Latin name. It has the Latin name and also the Icelandic name. This one was published a number of years ago. This one, I think, was 1986. And it takes that whole principle and turns it into a book with photographs. So what was interesting to me is that this actually helped me translate this book from Icelandic into English, because this is in English and it also has the Icelandic name. So I did a project several years ago with Jack Straw Center over in Seattle, where I translated plant names from Icelandic into English, and I read that it was an audio recording that was made there, and they went along with an installation of sculptures that I had made at the same time. But this idea of naming and chronicling and numbering and kind of making sense of the bigger world is something that continues to interest me, and the books that you see have helped with that. This is a sketchbook that I took on one of my trips, and you can, if you flip through, I've actually marked one of the pages where I've tried to identify these different kinds of sedge seeds, and these shapes have become, they became wall sculptures. So I drew the outline in heavy gauge wire, and then I filled the inside with different kinds of textile techniques, like knit wire or crocheted wire or these different kinds of things. So that's all I've got. Anybody have questions?
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't know that before.
How are you taking this next?
Well, I am actually a few weeks out from an artist residency in Chile, and so I'll be there for a month in the desert in the northern part of Chile, and it's been over 25 years since I went on this big adventure to Iceland. I went back a couple times, but a year of living there, and so this has been a great reason for me to think about things that are threads that have run through my work, and remind myself that I actually have made some artwork. I've been a single mom raising 2 kids who are now in college, and I think that I just haven't allowed myself the time to think about those kinds of things. And so I think where it takes me is it's kind of a reassuring look at how, even if I'm just recording information about where I am, that will inform whatever work I make in the future. So writing, keeping a good journal, and drawing and writing as much as possible.
Do you have an idea for what you want to do, or do you want to go and respond to the country before you?
I have ideas of what I would like to do, but I don't trust that that's the right direction. The place that I'm going is a place that is very ecologically sensitive, and I've learned that there is unrestricted lithium mining going on there in the salt flats, and so I'd like to see what that looks like. What does this, what does a salt flat look like in Chile? Is there anything that talks to me about? That sounds so art speaky. Just a landscape talking to me. But I think that I have ideas about recording sound. I have ideas about, here's something that just I learned yesterday. This area is so dry that apparently the visibility for the stars is just phenomenal, and they have there's a thing called the Very Large Millimeter Array of observatories in that area. And I just talked to a friend of mine in Santiago, and she said that indigenous people created constellations that used the dark space between the stars as guides as well as the stars. So that, I can't stop thinking about that now. Yeah. And I've done some work. I've started on a project where I've been embroidering and cutting holes in these black blankets with trying to make these kind of Milky Way star collections on blankets. And so but I've never finished it. It's been something really interesting to me, but I always kind of put it aside as something that I need to work on when I have time. And so I won't be taking those, but I'll be thinking about what informs that too.
What will you be taking?
I just went through my paper drawer at home, and I'm taking an assortment of paper, and especially watercolor and heavier drawing paper. And I'm taking my colored pencils that I took to Iceland, and my watercolor set. And I was given some of those watercolors that come on paper. They're saturated paper that you can get wet, and then so I'll be taking some of those, as little as possible, really. I'm taking some embroidery floss and some hemp twine, and I asked the woman who's coordinating the residency to pick up a pair of scissors so I didn't have to try to smuggle them through minimum stuff. I'm not taking any wire. I don't think.
Copper is a big deal. You can get copper wire.
Yeah.
Take
Yeah.
wine.
Take wine. Taking wine. That's my grandma. I'm taking wire. I think they have wine there.
Wire and wine. I heard the word wine.
Wire.
Oh, wire. Kristin, can you describe the winter in Iceland a little bit?
The winter when I was there was, there were some beautiful, very calm, snowy days where the sky was bright and, where it had snowed overnight and then the sky opened up, and it was extraordinarily beautiful in that kind of dim light. But it was very dark, and my whole sleep pattern shifted so that I would go to bed at 3 in the morning, and then I would wake up at 9 in the morning, because that's when it would, start to get a little bit, it would start to feel like it was getting light, but it was hard it was really, it threw you off. one really memorable moment was in the house where I was living. There was a north wind one night and it was snowing, and something about the old window wasn't completely sealed, and snow started piling up in the living room because it was coming in through the bottom of the window that was not quite sealed. So I had a little car by then that was an East German Trabant, and it's basically like, it looks like a driving lawnmower, but it's covered. And so, and remarkably, that was a good thing to drive in the snow. It had little snow tires, and but it wasn't like, I mean, there wasn't a place to go cross-country skiing. It was all too rugged, and so really just walking a lot in the snow. Yeah.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So before you went to Iceland, how did your work relate in this way to the landscape? And as you say, you know, it's carried on for
Yeah.
a long time.
I actually asked Amy if I could bring a slide carousel and show some slides. I would have shown you my thesis project from graduate school was a 10-foot tall, 40-inch wide grid that I hand welded out of steel, and it was kind of contoured. It was made based on an ingress to an enclosed courtyard on the campus of Cranbrook Academy of Art, where I went to grad school. And so I had taken plumb readings to recreate this contour, and then I turned it into this vertical gate that replaced the gate to the courtyard. And in each one of the grid openings was one of those little specimen bags clipped on with a specimen of something from inside the courtyard. So it was really, I was interested in this kind of displacement and connecting. I think that I wanted to honor the tradition of metalsmithing, which has to do with, you know, gate making or jewelry making, and that I'm more of a conceptual metalsmith. Although I do actual jewelry, I always think of myself as kind of a hack, because I didn't come up in a BFA program where I was learning all the techniques. I did learn techniques, but not 4 years worth of techniques. So it was related in the kind of specimen, kind of gridding things out, and also in that, you know, collecting and interest in how environment shapes somebody's response to art. I was going to bring a CD, which I did not bring. You may be able to find some of it online, but there's an interesting CD that was put out probably 8 or 10 years ago, that's a collection of different kinds of poems, traditional Icelandic poems. And there is kind of the saga prose poem, and then there are poems that are very kind of romantic and talking about how beautiful the sun is on the mountains. But then there's this whole other genre of poetry that's sung, and so these are people singing these poems that are interesting. So I'm also interested in how language or storytelling impacts artwork. And another thing that I heard about that is happening in Chile is that there is a symphony that's been created that will be performed while I'm there. I don't know if I'll get to see it, that is based on measurements of the stars. So the music was composed based on measurements of the stars, but this is that kind of, it's not synesthesia, but that kind of place where science and art really start to intermingle is interesting to me, because I'm just I'm interested in science, but I'm not skilled at it. And interestingly enough, my sister is a naturalist, and so but we talk about these things all the time. Our worlds kind of dovetail. She's very aesthetically astute, has done a lot of, you know, graphic design work also, and ceramics, and so I like that kind of the blurriness. Yeah.
Very, very nice.
Where
Thanks.
is your
Yeah.
glass necklace?
I think it's making its way around.
Do you want to talk about these?
Oh, I think it's interesting to see how the varying degrees of what we would think of as professionalism in any kind of art making. And I'm also interested in the blurriness between something that's just made with materials that are available and how you elevate that into something very beautiful, and then times when you choose to be more casual about things. So,
This one's a little bit more like what you were doing. This is a lovely,
yeah,
one of a
it
kind.
is beautiful. So, do these go this way?
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. And in fact, that is more than likely the same mountain that I was looking at outside my studio. So the Akrafjall.
Is that somebody who would have been there?
This is one of the Icelandic artists. You can probably
Yeah.
say that better.
Svanborg Mattiasdóttir. Yeah, different mountains. And I mean, because views are really unobstructed because of the lack of significant trees, there are more trees there than there used to be, but they're not huge. A lot of the relationship is really to this kind of the profile of the landscape, the mountains. And one thing that I think is interesting about this format is that it's circular or kind of semi-elliptical. There's a tradition in, I think it's not just in Iceland, but it is prevalent in Iceland, called the view disc or the ringsjá, which is a format that is usually a bronze disc that's placed at a high point where you can orient yourself to all the topography that's around you. So you can look at the view disc and look ahead and look at what's happening out in front of you, and then find out what it is looking on the disc, and you have a 360-degree view of that. Yeah, beautiful. So, no more questions?
Have you seen, in your
Yeah.
period of visiting there, have you seen effects of climate change?
I'm not sure. Do you want this passed around? Okay, sure.
Because like you said, you know, the lack of trees, and then you said no significant trees, and
Yeah.
okay.
I will say, yeah,
Yeah, that's probably not the best place for it. Because that's got the.
the major changes that I've seen are the development changes, and I haven't been back for long enough periods of time to see any impact of climate change on a regular basis, but I know that they've had much warmer winters and warmer and wetter winters than when I was there. And that the glaciers are retreating in similar ways.
Was there something about metal as a medium that initially attracted you to metalsmithing?
So I became interested in metalsmithing because it seemed to bridge this space between the art side of things and the anthropology side of things. And I liked that, especially I do like that jewelry has an interface between, or creates an interface between people. It can speak, it can be responded to, people feel like it's like a third person in the room sometimes. And I also started making jewelry at a time when there was a lot of permission being given to making it out of things that you just came up with, like gum wrappers, or in my case it was, I was really drawn to more industrial materials, and at the time, steel wire was like the bottom feeders material. It was really cheap, It was dirty, but it still had this quality that I could apply these textile techniques to. So it was satisfying to be able to pull it out and work on it without having any particular tools needed. I mean, really, I have a pair of pliers that I use most often, and then one that I use second most often, and that's kind of it. So I think I became interested in its flexibility and just how I could kind of, in a way, cheat the tradition by just working with my hands instead of having to have a torch or a roller or, you know, a brake or all these things that I had come to understand were part of the metalsmith's tool vocabulary, but I just wanted to simplify, and yeah, so all those things.
Great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah.
I know.